Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here to listen to Françoise Gaill, and there are many people online as well, so we have a hybrid meeting. And for this meeting, in our conference of the Veolia Institute, with a specialist of oceans, of the deep sea, extreme situations. Françoise Gaill is a biologist and oceanographer, very well-known one, and she is a emeritus researcher at the CNRS, and she's going to be talking about a very important topic, very important for the entire world, and that is the future of oceans and our relationship with oceans. A long time ago, in the framework of the foundation, because Françoise is a member of the Board of Administrators of the Veolia Foundation, I've heard you talk about living creatures, and you often have very sad and worrying stories about the ocean. But at the same time, you said that it's a fantastic source of inspiration. So we wanted to cover that variety of topics with Françoise today, because we know very well that oceans are part of the solution to a lot of issues to do with climate change, as well as biodiversity, food security, and at the same time that oceans are also impacted by human behavior and what's going on land, and the political and geopolitical environment, the threats that we have to face, new ones amongst them. So this is what we wanted to talk about. So our meeting will, well, first of all, I'll be questioning Françoise. She'll provide answers. Then we will open up the debate for the room to hear your questions. And then at noon, for those of you who are here, we will have a quick lunch cocktail with Françoise, and you can continue discussing with her. Is that okay with all of you? Great. So all of these topics, with a new warning bell from the new U.S. administration, even though we won't go into the politics here, but this may very well have consequences for us and for the ocean. So my first question is that, well, everybody knows that oceans are linked to climate change, and they play a fundamental role in avoiding climate change, but at the same time, they are victims of new phenomena to do with ocean currents, acidification, pollution, and all of this plays an important role. But we don't know how these phenomena actually work and how they're interlinked. So I wanted to ask you about the ocean's role as a regulator. What does it regulate, and what are the new challenges and risks that we have to face with climate change? Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here today. Thank you very much for having come to listen to our talk about oceans. Yes, ocean is part of the climate system. So what does that mean? It's the ocean that actually shapes, in a way, the climate, with interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere. Currently, with ongoing changes and with climate deregulation, and we can say deregulation given the pace of change that we're seeing, the ocean is able to absorb 90% of all heat linked to greenhouse warming gases, to greenhouse gases. So 90% are absorbed by oceans. They're heat sinks, and that is a very important role because this allows the human species and all other forms of life to be able to survive at the surface of the Earth. Would be absolutely impossible if it weren't for the ocean. A second important thing is that it's a heat sink. I'm sure you've all heard of CO2, global warming, and all of this is due to greenhouse gases and human activities. So this carbon sink, the heat sink, can absorb almost 30% of all of our CO2 emissions. And those two types of heat sink or these emissions are due to climate change. But this also illustrates how oceans can actually be our life insurance for tomorrow. And the second thing I wanted to say about climate change is that life comes from the ocean. Life was born in the ocean. First of all, at the surface, but now we also know that it's highly probable that also life being born at the very bottom of the sea. And those life forms took a very long time to emerge and to come onto dry land along the coasts and the continents. This is an aspect which is often little known, but there are 250,000 species which have been identified in the ocean today and nearly 2 million on Earth. Of course, we don't know the ocean very well, not the way we know land. We may reach 1 million species in the future, and some oceanographic expeditions, Tara exposition, for example, has highlighted the microbial diversity, which is absolutely incredible in the oceans. So we will certainly know more about those millions of species soon. And another very important aspect for oceans is oxygen. The oxygen we breathe comes from the ocean. Over our evolution, the oxygen produced 50% of all of the oxygen we breathe. And breathing for us is an extremely important phenomenon. And looking at relationships between the intensification of extreme weather events we're witnessing, humidification of the atmosphere, which will certainly lead to consequences on humans' breathing as well. And we may be able to come back to this later. And then there are other services rendered by the ocean. For example, food resources. Even if the potential for wild sea resources and what is found naturally in the ocean is becoming reduced with overexploitation of resources. And yet it provides food for millions of humans. And then my last point, something you mentioned earlier, is the way in which this natural capital also has important substances for human health and which could be very beneficial for the future. So what do we know currently about the seriousness of ocean warming and the disappearance of species? And why is it important to us to take this very seriously? And then I will ask if we do take it seriously and are we taking necessary measures? Things are changing. Up until now, there was little variation in the ocean. When you think that 90% of heat in the tropics is absorbed by the oceans, well, this is going to have a consequence on the state of oceans. The consequences, well, first of all, rising temperatures. And when the temperatures rise in the ocean, there's actually an expansion of the volume of the ocean. And this leads to rising sea levels, which will lead to flooding, submersion of all of the coastal, and all of the coastal populations will be impacted. And this is a major problem that we're going to have to face. And how soon? What are the current projections? Actually, it's already starting. Now, we shouldn't just take into account reduction strategies to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, But things are going so quickly that we already have to take measures to try to see how we can get organized for these coastal populations. What can politics do in agreement with society to be able to maybe build barriers, polders, digs, but none of that will be enough. But we do have to find ways of reducing the impact of this flooding, and certainly will have to displace these populations, and this is something that we absolutely have to take seriously. There's a project which is called Cities, which takes this idea and works with policy deciders, so mayors of cities, small towns along the coast, to find adapted solutions, so adapted to local conditions. And I think that our foundation is a partner of cities. Do we already have examples of towns which are now thinking about displacing their populations because of rising sea levels? Yes, indeed. In France, for example, over the past few years, they've set up regional IPCCs. It started with Nouvelle-Aquitaine and now Normandy, Bretagne, and southern France. So these regional IPCCs, in Normandy, for example, the way in which researchers are working with policymakers are measuring local sea levels using not necessarily the same instruments as IPCC, but at least with the development of scientific studies. It's a way of giving concrete facts to policymakers. So Normandy is working on this. Nouvelle-Aquitaine has also been working on these questions for a long time. And there's a lot that's extremely interesting. There are also small island developing states which are susceptible of being impacted by rising sea levels, and they've also been thinking about solutions for a long time, including having to leave their countries. And for a time, they'll be able to move from island to island, but it will ensure planning for the future with the entire populations. But Jakarta, for example, which is a wonderful city, has decided to change their location because of the rising sea levels and climate change. And just before we move on to another question, there's a lot of talk currently about the Gulf Stream, which is being impacted, and all of this that it signifies for the United States, for Latin America. Is this going to disappear? And then the ocean flows will be impacted by climate change and ocean phenomena. What should we think about this?
For now, we have no concrete data. When I say that more than 90% of the heat goes into the ocean, we don't know exactly where. We're doing some simulations to see when the temperature of the North Atlantic is going to go down, where the circulation of the North Atlantic will go down, and what consequences will be. Take a drop in the movement of the ocean because of thermosaline operation. There'll be more layers of the oceans that will be stagnant. There'll be no more movement, and that will have consequences on the quality of seawater. There'll be other events, like, for example, the fact that the ocean will no longer be able to get its function, carry out his actions in terms of carbon dioxide and heat, and we'll be faced with the consequences of our actions, and we'll have to do something about that. Right. there's actually a new issue which is also ambivalent because it's a source of resources and a risk for the ocean. And I'm talking about the resources, which we talked about fishing resources, overfishing and the consequences that has. But nowadays we're talking about mining the mineral resources of the ocean, polymetallic nodules, and many actors see this as a huge economic opportunity. There's already permits that have been given. Are these resources minimal? Is it an extra risk for the oceans? And can we mine these potential resources sustainably? We don't know if they exist. Now, this is a very current debate, and I think society is going to be talking about this for years to come. We have three types of mineral resources that could be useful. Polymetallic nodules, sulfurs, sulfic masses, which you can find in hydrothermal sources. These hydrothermal sources were discovered in the 1980s, quite late. And they could actually house very rare, unique species, amazing species actually, because they're amazing because when you think of where they are, it gives us an idea of how powerful life is for adapting to this. They live in extremely acidic areas, in very high temperatures of over 100 degrees, in very metallic environments, so it's a toxic environment. And despite living in what is an environmental hell, these species can adapt, they can survive. And we found one of the reasons for which these species adapt: the use of a process that's quite different from the process of photosynthesis. It's what we call chemiosynthesis. They don't need light to produce oxygen. They're capable to use a bacteria they've cultivated in their cells, in their bodies, to transform this bacteria into mineral and organic materials. It's actually quite a hopeful message for us. These species were able to adapt, so we ought to be able to find solutions to the problems we're faced with. Apart from these aspects, when we talk about metal sulfurs or other concentrations, the fact is we're going to have an issue with the energy transition, and we will need minerals. The idea of going into the ocean and not having any impact is seen as a solution by some industrialists. This is quite wrong. We don't have the proof that the economic potential is good. Secondly, these concentrations are extremely small. We don't know if they're that abundant. We don't know if they're more abundant than on the Earth. And thirdly, it's really problematic that we're faced with a problem. We don't know what exists, so we can't imagine the impact mining these resources would have, because less than 5% of these areas have been looked at from the point of view of knowledge. You know, we don't know that much on the sea bottoms, or can be in different areas, and it has to do with all this. One thing I haven't said so far, in the next edition of a facts report, there'll be an article from Françoise on what we can see in terms of benefits, you making use of all these creatures and their capability to adapt to help human help. And using equipment we have that's ready for the sea bottom geothermal energy, they're in the starting blocks. These are minor things because we don't have an economic model and so forth. How do we see that? We need to focus on this nowadays because some states like Nauru, very small insular states who don't have many means, were pretty much bought out by Total, for example, to be able to access these mineral resources in the sea bottoms. So this could happen in the very near future. So there was discussions with a body called ISA. The companies said we need a mining code so we can start mining, digging. There is a major international disagreement on this, and France is on the forefront of a fight against this mining, even though there are almost 30 countries who agree on the fact that we ought to dig. Many NGOs, including mine, are working on this issue of knowing what should we do in the future and why, basing ourselves on a scientific knowledge to get a message across, to see what can be done to not have an ecological catastrophe on the sea bottom, which could have a consequence on the entire ocean. So there are international tensions of it on this. 170 countries don't agree with the other factors. No, many are not speaking on this, but small insular states, which are the ones that will be the most impacted by this, well, smaller states are saying we're also allowed to develop. We don't have the tools, we don't have the wherewithal that the West has. We have to work on this. We need to work hard to make something sustainable. So we need the knowledge. We need to be able to explore, to see what's on the sea bottoms and what we can do to have something sustainable. Thanks to several research programs, France has developed a very large-scale program for the exploration, the study of this area. The idea is to have the tools that would allow us to know about these spaces, knowing about animals, minerals, chemical elements in the sea bottoms. That will give us a sustainable solution that will allow us to be more sustainable. The idea is that politicians need to listen to scientists. That's not an easy win. So these research programs will have an influence on political decision at the French, European and global level, at the level of the UN. We hope so. We hope it'll be the case. We're working for that. You need to recognize that the IPCC did have difficult years, but they were able to promote knowledge as a platform on which states must base themselves to know what to do in the future. It doesn't mean there's no climate skepticism, but there's less climate skepticism. If we have a COP29 in this very, interesting place, there is one thing that is clear to everyone. Climate change does exist, and we need to do what we can to limit climate change. Scientists are there to give access to knowledge. On the sea bottoms, we don't have knowledge on what's going on in the deep sea. How long did the GIEC need to write reports for states to take this seriously? They needed 30 years, 20 years, 30 years. So we've got an international panel for oceanic sustainability who's working on trying to find the tools to create a link between academic knowledge and political action, to give tools for different strategies that can be implemented, not just with politicians, but with actors as a whole, all the actors. We think that IPOS, the International Panel for Oceanic Sustainability, has the support of the European Commission, and they'll be able to use this for their next meeting in Nice in June. It's the third UN meeting on the oceans. There's no COP for the oceans. We have a COP for the climate. We have a conference of parties for biodiversity, but none for the oceans. We think that the third conference of United Nations could start working on having a conference of parties for the oceans. It would be part of the SDGs. So the IPCC worked a lot with the media, scientifics, pulling the warning bells, ringing the warning bells. We realized that this strategy could exist. We could do do a bit more, because people will say, what's the point of doing another thing? But the idea is to show why it's so important to talk about this. We need a more open platform than the IPCC. They want to create links. They want to federate people. They want to reconcile people to find a solution that's co-constructed with all the actors. That's what we need to do. We think that thanks to the European Commission and thanks to UNESCO, we'll be able to find a solution. The European Commission can be an actor on this. Well, I think that the European Commission is very modern in how it looks at these issues. And it's played a crucial role in the funding of the IPCC and on funding the analysis we base our knowledge on. And we are working with the European Marine Board, 34 scientific institutions at European level, and other institutions and other NGOs. This allows us to say that, yes, they are very innovative in how they dare to present something. The European Commission is going to have a notion back that will be drafted. Pascal Lamy will be one of the people who is in charge of coordinating this, and we hope that in this ocean pack there'll be something about the deep sea. We can be proud of what the European Commission does on the oceans. Thank you.
And, okay, I can't not ask this, but what does the election of Donald Trump signify, and who is going to be appointing to the Environmental Protection Agency? So what impact is this going to have? Is this going to delay projects? Will it mobilize people? What do you think is going to happen? Well, yes, there will definitely be an impact. For IPOS, for example, and major scientific institutions which are part of these coalitions that we coordinate, it's a catastrophe that NOAA is being targeted by the future president of the United States will also have consequences for everything to do with climate change. So NOAA is the agency for observation of the sea and the atmosphere, of oceans and the atmosphere. And they bring together all of the observations carried out by scientific bodies from the United States and also from around the world. It's sort of the same thing as Mercator in Europe. But the fact that its disappearance has been announced, I mean, I hope it won't happen, but it probably will. And this will have a true impact. Scientists will no longer have access to the data. And then for the COP, for the IPCC, the disappearance of institutions which participate in knowledge gathering, which share this knowledge, which raise awareness as to climate change. For us, this is an absolute disaster. We will get organized. I tend to be optimistic, and I believe that Europe will have a very important role to play. We also have to provide support for scientists in the US, and we're currently doing that. Great. And so for international cooperation, so we saw the important role of Europe. Worries around some American institutions. Are there other actors who are highly mobilized? China, for example. The Russians. Are there other countries that are active? What are the main challenges and the main worries, as well as the main reasons to be optimistic? Well, I wanted to come back to and highlight one of the aspects. For climate change, it took the Paris COP, the COP21, to see the ocean appear in the final report. It was in the introduction. And since then, the IPCC has been considering a special report on oceans. And now it's becoming ever more visible. So this aspect, what incidence has that had? Well, it's highlighted people who do deal with the ocean. For example, China. They have a very ambiguous position. But if there's a single state today that is developing scientific and technological research on oceans, this is China. I was at the CNRS, the Institute for the Ecology of the Environment, so when I was still a researcher, and I had access to China's 10-year program for ocean research, and I was amazed by their ambition. And today, and especially with Trump now, the primary actor for oceans in technology, in geostrategy, this will be China. And it's important to note that. And China is one of our supporters for IPOS. They're highly interested by all innovations in this area. And the second thing I wanted to say is that currently there are things we can do, but what about tomorrow? I think what's happening in the United States, we have to realize that it could happen here too. So we have to make provisions for this. We have to prepare. We have to prepare for not only what is rational, but also communities of knowledge, communities of businesses, we have to set these up to have a true foundation for innovation and to continue to be able to take action which is consistent with their own rationality. Okay, we can see a lot of people are fed up with punitive measures. That's true with populists everywhere, but we haven't heard much yet. And okay, rising sea levels, disastrous flooding, but a lot of people are fed up with the fact that we're concentrating on oceans. Well, the oceans are far away. Why should we invest in oceans whereas it's so far away? But all of our actions, sooner or later, will have something to do with the ocean. So for a drop of water to come back to the same place again, you need a whole century. So it's very long term. This is future generations we're talking about. And if we project ourselves, we have to start working on it right now. We have to take action now, and only later will the effects be felt. So to be able to mobilize people and to avoid opposite mobilization, and also to get people on board, is maybe the aspect of human health could be used as a lever. Could that be used as one of the main reasons to take action, to provide new medicines, maybe more than biodiversity that not everybody cares about? Should we maybe bet more on our links to human health to take action and to avoid all backlash? I think that is a good idea. The IPBES will be publishing a report a month from now around the nexus of climate, biodiversity, food, human health. And this is a nexus which deserves more work. And I think the One Health concept is also a way of reminding everybody how much we depend not only on ourselves, but also on our immediate surroundings and on all life. As that includes our environment. And there's the potential capital of everything to do with pharmacopoeia, pharmaceutical products, cancer treatments, dermatological treatments. It's the ocean which is going to be a gold mine for all of this. The latest results we received from the Genome Project highlights all of this, and there are companies that are patenting genome sequences so that they can then commercialize them through industrial uses. And so that could be useful. So we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I think there are people in the room there who are concerned by this nexus, and you may have questions. And we have the great good fortune to have Françoise with us, and we still have 15 minutes. And then if you want to continue discussion, we also have the lunch, and you'll be able to ask more questions. I know that we have a few questions online. But first of all, those of you in the room, is there anybody with a question for Françoise Gaill? Now's your chance. And Nicolas, yes. Always reliable. Hello, thank you very much. I have a question for the protected areas of the ocean. We've heard that they're actually not really protected, and that the industrial fishing lobby is extremely active in this area, and they are destroying seabeds. Could you say more about this? Because quantitatively speaking, it's quite monstrous in terms of how much of the ocean bed they're destroying. Yes, thank you very much for your question. I did not mention this. And it's true that the protected marine areas are very important tools to protect biodiversity, as well as to protect ocean health. It was when there was the BB&G agreement, this was a fabulous moment. So this is for high seas, to give us time to think about rules for access to this biodiversity in the open sea, to make sure we have the proper legislative framework. And these protected areas are important tools to constitute life reserves. And it's the connection between these various protected areas which would make it possible to have a 30 by 30 in terms of the Montreal Agreement. So why is it said that they aren't really protected? Well, it's not because you say, okay, this area is going to be a protected area, that it's actually protected, because it's expensive to protect areas. It takes monitoring, and all protected areas are not monitored. And work has shown that in the Mediterranean, for example, almost only 1% of supposedly protected areas are actually protected. And well, Europe now has enacted a number of qualification categories for these protected areas, going from very high protection, medium protection, low protection. And the goal is to assess the quality of these protected areas. Just like with climate change, it's going to require a lot of public investment in monitoring these protected areas. We already know that some are very well protected, and that for fishermen who are working in the vicinity of these areas, they do see an increase in fishing stocks. So that means it's possible to restore species, but to do so you have to protect certain areas. To bring levels back up to what's normal. It's extremely important to know this, because this means that it's also a message of hope as to what actions we take. And also, industrials are less interested than small-scale fishermen by this type of thing. Industrial fisheries work on huge areas, and there's very little actually that we can do to modify their behavior. But Europe is doing what it can to increase the regulation of this type of fishing activities, and they're doing their best to protect these areas, to lessen the impact of the biodiversity loss. And I do think it's possible. And the results that Europe has obtained show that actions can have results, including for fish and for marine biodiversity.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for your presentation. When it comes to mining sea beds for nodules and so forth, I have heard that the Pacific sea bottom was already cut up by some countries. Is it to protect them or to start mining as soon as possible? We have an international authority for seabeds that was set up after the Montego Bay Convention was signed to analyze what actions need to be carried out when it comes to this shared heritage for minerals on the sea bottoms and mineral mining. They've set up a consultation and action mode that firstly decided to carry out exploration missions. So the first seabed that was mined, there was a call to the states who wanted to have a possibility to explore them. And France was one of these countries, within those teams, in these countries, who had the opportunity to profit from this process. There are 2 permits, one next to Chiperton, we call it the zone, and the next one is in the zone itself. And then after, more and more countries wanted to be able to access this possibility to explore. But it didn't mean exploiting, mining the sea bottom, the seabed. There's a possibility of exploiting them. There is a presence or absence of these structures. I've talked about Nehru, which is a country that was pushed by some companies to say we could go faster and further. We know where the largest mines are. They had the legal possibility of doing this if a majority of states voted in favor of this. They had the legal possibility of going to exploration. And it's this definition of a mining code that allowed to warn the states on how urgent it is to take into account the severity of a situation. They developed several techniques that are adapted to the seabed as like a sort of combine harvester that's on the seabed. There's some operations carried out by Japan, Norway, Belgium as well. Some actors are interested in these facts. Actually, Norway. Well, let's not forget that the Norwegian government wasn't against these exploitations. And they said that in an exclusive economic area, they would do it if they could. If they said they would do it. Right. So despite their green appearance, the Norwegians are thinking of exploiting these resources. Do they want to do this sustainably? I think Norway doesn't have many scientists they can turn to do all this, even though they have a scientific community that's produced a report that reminds the world of how urgent a situation is and how urgent it is to do something. As scientists, we think they're developing some tools, but they're not going to go as far as to exploit these resources. There's one thing that's interesting. States have, preempted parts of the ocean. They've got exclusive economic areas up to 200 maritime miles out from the coast. And then they talked about extending this up to 30,000 maritime miles, but not the oceans itself. It's from the bottom of a seabed. France profited from this because it's got many overseas territory. It's got an increase of up to 700 maritime square miles. This mineral operation for the mineral exploitation of this. So the fact is they need to emit laws. We're going to need to legislate on this for exploitation of the seabeds. Small insular states are thinking about how they can get together to have a text that will allow them to base themselves on a sort of coalition or getting together, working with countries who are working on exploitation to describe a sustainable way of mining these seabeds. They're talking about how they could do this. I think it's actually quite commendable. They're the only ones who say it's the only resources we have near our islands. Why shouldn't we be allowed to profit from this if we do this in a sustainable way? Yes, but we're scientists. We think we need to know what's going on down there before we start mining. Okay, there's a question here and one in the back. Yes, okay. We'll take your question, and then there's one there, and then the one online. Thank you. Thank you for what you said. The hope of adapting. A quick word on plastics in the oceans. Some species are using these plastics. They use them as nests and so forth. Could you tell us about plastics in the oceans? Now, life has so much imagination. You have no idea. Plastics. One of the issues with plastics is plastics break down into very small nanoparticles, and very few animal species will be able to use them apart from bacteria. And this micro aspect has started to have consequences on human health. So we need to be very wary of the consequences of plastics. Right, very quickly, we have 150 people connected online. I'll just regroup the questions. First question. At the individual and corporate level, what concrete actions can we carry out to safeguard, to protect the oceans? Basically, bear in mind everything you bin can go to the ocean. The ocean isn't far. The ocean's just here. It's below us. It's us. We depend on the oceans. Then we need to be sober, frugal, and not throw out too many things. And thirdly, try and go and see the sea. Second question. Abyssal plains. Are they the object of regulations? At the United Nations level, there's one plain I mentioned. They've delimited a zone. Zones are places where the UN give scientifics the possibility to explore, not mine, not exploit for resources, no, to explore. It's very much legislated. A concrete example of scientific knowledge into being translated into political action. I talked about how climate change will impact the coastal populations. How do we need to organize ourselves, knowing that we will use our knowledge? What are we going to, and also thinking about how the sea levels are going to go up by 1-2 meters, and what we're going to do about this. Right, now it's time. We can probably continue chatting with Françoise around the buffet, but there's someone who's got a mic. Good morning. Thank you for these discussions. I just have one preoccupation, be it exploration or exploiting the oceans? Are we not going towards economic issues? And is there a decarbonation strategy linked to this exploration? I'm not sure I understood your questions, as Françoise. When it comes to exploring seabeds for decarbonation of companies that will explore, well, how green they are will be taken into account. When it comes to exploring the oceans, there is not, as such, any global action that has been identified as such. And climate change means that carbon taxes can play a part for maritime transport, for how we'll regulate fishing. That will also have an impact on these things. Thank you very much. Thanks for having explored so many different avenues of research. Thank you for your research. Thank you for your optimism. Thank you for your commitment, and thank you for your work on the oceans. You'll read what Madame Gaill has to say on environmental health on our next episode, in our next edition of Facts, which will come out in January 2025. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.